working on some theme of maybe like maybe this will be like the sleeping bus driver. I kind of draw like you're walking through the forest, you know, where you don't really know where you're going, and you just start from some point and randomly travel through the paper until you get to a place where you finally reach your destination. And I think that with drawing, sometimes I'll just think, well, I'm just going to start with a human head. That'll be or a personage of some sort. And then I'm just going to expand it into whatever it's going to take me to. And I like to work quickly. I don't see why it takes so long to make drawings. I mean, basically you're working like the way a performer plays a violin, let's just say. Like there's going to be a slow movement, a saraband or something of that nature, and then there's going to be a presto vivace. But you can't miss any of the notes in either one. And so the tempo is very important when it comes to art. And I think some art has like a very slow tempo, and some art has a very upbeat tempo. But it's not that easy to figure out on an upbeat tempo looking piece if it was actually made very slowly or if it was made very quickly. Sometimes you look at a de Kooning painting of a woman and you might think that he just smashed the whole thing together in, like, you know, right away. But on the other hand, it may have taken him months of just very slight, you know, meticulous changes until it all just came together the way you wanted it. So you never know when you make a drawing or when you make a painting where it's going to take you. Drink. When I grew up in New Hampshire, a sort of very rural mountainous place, and then my family moved to another very small sort of apple orchard, lots of cows, little town near Boston. And we were going to St. Mary's Church. And I came back and I made this drawing of a crucifixion. It was really the first drawing that my mother kept of my work. And she said, you know, I can't believe you had such a morbid sensibility as a child. You never did stick figures. You never did, like, you know, a big sun and a little head, you know, with a, you know, big heads and stick figure type things. It was always a very kind of serious approach to drawing. For me, it was always about, like, I think even when I first began making drawings, a way of expressing my feelings. And I had a kind of a profound feeling of this strange crucifixion with Christ on the cross with blood dripping down. But I interpreted it in a strange way, my own sort of way, where they were all, the thorns were sort of, on his crown of thorns were sort of abstracted into a background sort of abstraction to a certain degree. But then, as I developed, you know, I started drawing dinosaurs. I loved drawing dinosaurs when I was 6 or 7. And my grandfather was a doctor. So I would go to his practice, to his office, and he would give me his letterhead. And I'd sit there and draw dinosaurs for him. And he was Italian. He barely spoke English, to tell you the truth. And I'd try to draw them as accurately as I could. And then, just to be sure that he didn't think that, you know, I was presuming that a dinosaur was bright red or bright green, I would write not authentic color next to it, just so that it was clear that this is the way I believe they look, but this is not necessarily the color. And I hadn't really ever thought about showing those works until we framed them. And I said, you know, in some ways they're very concrete early statements that led into my concept about, let's just say, jump, you know, 40 years ahead or 30 years ahead to this idea of fake old masters. And the sort of not authentic color leading to fake old masters was a very sort of bizarre, realization later. And then I started to get into fishing with my brother, and I did a really accurate drawing of a sunfish for my mother, which she saved. And most of all the art I have was saved by my mom. And I think it was a result of being rejected from sports that she thought to put me in a painting class, saying, well, you love painting, you love art, why don't you do that? And so every Saturday I would go take painting classes at the YWCA. It wasn't even the YMCA. So it was a bit humiliating, with my brother on the baseball team and me going there and being this sort of nerdy kid doing drawings of clipper ships and things of that nature. And then I think by the time I got to be a teenager, I started really taking it seriously and starting to expose myself to literature about art. And one of the first books I read about art was Gertrude Stein's book on Picasso. And that was a very seminal moment for me in terms of the belief that even he was very young when he started. I discovered that, geez, Picasso was like 6 or 7 years old when he was making these incredible works of art. So I could maybe have a chance. I can do it. I like doing this stuff, And, but I could see how he had this European training and how in America there was no European training. Back in the 60s, everything was about minimalism, everything was about pop art. And so I think it was at that point that I realized that art was more than just representation. It was a kind of a trip into your mind and what you could see in there and how you could materialize it in the form of a visual experience. By the time I reached college, I thought, I've done hundreds and hundreds of drawings. I'm so immersed into it. And simultaneously, at that point, I began studying classical music. Once I started to feel like, I don't really know if I'm going to be an artist when I grow up or what I'm going to do, but I know I love it. And I know I can't do anything else, but at the same time, I'd love to understand more about music. So I was playing classical music and learning a lot of Bach and a lot of Renaissance music. So by the time college came around, when I was 17 or 18, I decided that I didn't want to take painting classes. I didn't want to be criticized by teachers. I didn't want them to tell me, listen, you need to start at the beginning. And just to go back to that one thing about academic training that artists like Picasso, Matisse, and Cezanne had, and what they rebelled against. Artists from my generation, our sort of first real, let's call it classical training, was to begin from abstraction. And I began with Kandinsky and Mondrian and some of the really wild abstract paintings that were happening, either futurist sculptures, Boccioni and these people, and then moved from abstraction into realism. So it was a complete reverse process from the way things happened in the late sort of 19th century into the early 20th century. And I think the mid-20th century was going from abstraction into realism. And so I started thinking a lot about how to take realism to another level, as opposed to, say, representation. And musically, I understood, so by the time I got to college and I was studying music theory, I understood exactly how music was composed, that you could hear it, and it sounded like it all made sense, but when you really read it and studied it and realized how rigid of a sort of formal construction it really was, at that point I realized music was not free enough for me to be really, let's just say, any kind of exponential player in the world of music. It was one thing to be an interpreter, and to play Bach and to play Renaissance music. Another thing to actually compose music. When you study Beethoven's string quartets, you realize these things are practically like science. This is like physics. And art was more natural to me. It's such a mad, crazy world these days that everybody I draw is kind of a lunatic. Maybe make it nice. Contrast to the lunatic here. Let's see if I can do this. All these various components of music, art, and I would say philosophy, all started to become a sort of like if you could imagine a brain to be sort of like a television, where, you know, you can just switch channels instantly, and to try to find a way to create an iconic image out of this sort of interrelationship of all these different thoughts, philosophies, languages, and even musical structures, like the idea of variations and music. And I thought, well, there are variations that you could start to work with in paintings, and there are different time zones in art that could be equally interchangeable, that it doesn't have to be from today. Today could be, you know, 100 years from now, and today could be like 1,000,000 years ago. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is what's there on the canvas at one moment. And so I started to think that, you know, taking anything that I was sort of subjected to or was involved with, like from the position of from memory, whatever came through my mind, whatever I remembered, it may have been a constellation of different kinds of paintings all at once. Like all of a sudden I'd think of Velázquez, and I would think of the way he painted some fabric. But then, you know, that fabric and the way he painted it could be applied to a completely different subject. And then you could set it in a background that felt like a sky out of a Poussin painting. And you could get this sort of sweetness of a Fragonard and the harshness of Picasso. And you could interchange all of these languages simultaneously. And the thing that was happening in the 80s was this, I think someone like Polka in the late 70s and everything, he started to lay out various images at the same time so that they were like overlays of images. And Picabia did it in the beginning. But I wanted to find a way that all these images would combine themselves into one thing that would bring the recognition of many different things to people who saw it. So they might look at it and say, oh, this is really influenced by Goya, but yet Goya never would have painted that. Or this has this cubistic sort of qualities of Picasso, but it's applied to psychology as opposed to the psychology of a figure. And I think the most consistent thing in my work is this idea of humanity, of finding a way to represent the human consciousness in the representation through a portrait. And so that portrait could represent what's not only the exterior appearance of that person, but what's going through their mind and what emotional states could be happening to them and within them. And so you might see a train go by and two people chatting on the train, and one laughing, and then the next passenger is sitting there sort of crying, and if you combine those two emotions in one single figure, you've got that kind of cubistic look at things, but it's not seeing one object from all different angles, it's seeing one sort of, or many different emotional states in a single object. In the works like of the double portraits, they're called, double head portraits, you see a kind of a, sometimes a very realistic figure sort of in profile next to a very sort of abstracted cubistic type figure, or you'll see something like in a piece that we're showing called The Prisoner, where he's got this really scary face and he's locked in a kind of a, almost like a cage, and the shadow of himself is in the foreground sort of staring at who he is today, and his is a kind of an existential type of situation where he's, it's either the shadow that's really him, or it's the visual, you know, sort of representation of him that's really him. It's one or the other. And most of the drawings, like the bankers that I'm going to show, they have this kind of hystericized sort of triple personality, somewhere between conniving, greedy, you know, love of money, and very sort of sneaky, sort of happy at the same time. So you really don't know where they're coming from. You don't know if they're just being nice because they want your money, or if they're actually, you know, a sort of an evil entity who's smiling, you know, while they're, you know, while they're screwing you, you know. So, I mean, that can happen. And then to turn, you know, negatives into positives, like whatever is to consider to be a low form of art, or, you know, a negative to a certain degree, and this sort of, you know, just the ordinary characters that make up our lives, like whether it's the janitor or the bus driver or the school teacher or the principal, or whether it's the mailman or the truck driver. And these are not the glamorous people that you see on the covers of Vogue magazine, but they are what the world is composed of. And to give them a chance, you know, to sort of give them a spot in the world is, I think, what I always admired about Rembrandt to a certain degree, that he began with these really big commissions, and then as he ended his life toward, you know, he limited his palette to a very sort of 3 or 4 different colors of browns and blacks, and everybody just has this real soulful. They're not glamorous, they're not beautiful people anymore, especially not in self-portraits, but you can see the world